having a job is a sliver of being a thriving human being, but it becomes the sole reason of why we have schools. And that is a conversation that is more important now than ever in the age of AI, where we're all worried about it taking away our humanity. So let's have that conversation about what does it mean to be a human being.
Welcome to Reculture. My name is Casciotta. This is a podcast about better messages. Messages that don't just tell us what to react to. There are a lot of those right now. But ones that actually help us understand the moment that we're in. Ones that don't just grab our attention, but then point us somewhere afterwards. Because whether we are navigating a brand or a team or a family or even just the world right now, we are all living inside stories. And the most important story that we can navigate is the story that we're becoming. All right, if you are leading something, you are navigating change. You cannot escape change. The world changes, technology changes, customer expectations change, the people you serve and work with and even love, they all change. And here I think is every navigator's challenge, or at least this has been true for me. Like, it's knowing what should change and what shouldn't. Like, what do you preserve versus leave behind? What do you pivot on versus stick to your guns on? What version of reality do you decide to carry into the future? So I've spent a lot of this podcast talking about the things that people follow and latch onto during moments of change: adventure, myths, artifacts, a distinct voice. So for this episode, I'm going to play a conversation for you that I had recently on, wait for it, education. CJ, what are you doing? I thought you were talking about change. Hear me out, okay? Education is where a culture decides what gets carried forward. Education answers, what should the next generation know? What skills actually matter? What values should endure? What assumptions no longer fit reality? Those aren't just educational questions. Those are leadership questions. Those are cultural questions. And increasingly, they're the questions every organization is being forced to answer. So that's why I wanted to share this conversation with Nick Melvoin from the Los Angeles Unified School Board and Randy Ziegenfuss, a longtime educator and superintendent that we had at our Reculture Live event in Los Angeles. And on the surface, it's a conversation about schools here in the US, but underneath it, it's this exploration in what happens when the world changes and the people responsible for carrying something forward have to decide which story is going to survive. We have two really brilliant people over here, Dr. Randy Ziegenfuss and Nick Melvoin. And so I want you guys to give just a really brief snapshot about your positions and your background, and then we'll kind of just get into it.
Sure. So Randy Ziegenfuss is my name, and I am from Pennsylvania. Spent my entire life in Pennsylvania, and was in public education for the first part of my career. Spent a full 35 years there, retired in the middle of COVID. Now I'm working in higher education. I actually started as a music teacher and then got into administration and retired as a public school superintendent. I work in the education department at a university in Pennsylvania. And one of my main interests and curiosities along the way has been, how do we redesign the education system? And so I work primarily with doctoral students who are interested in being change makers, not only in the K-12 system, but the higher ed system, and also corporate learning spaces as well.
Hi, everyone. Nick Melvoin. But my surname was originally Melvoin. It's German, and it means flower maggot. Jews in the old country, we had to buy our names, and we didn't have a lot of money, and so we got flower maggot. And I always, I wish my great grandfather was still alive, because I always wanted to ask him, like, what else was available? I know we were poor, but I say that because when my great grandfather came over from this country to this country, escaping persecution in Europe at the turn of the last century, he was a kindergartner on the Lower East Side of New York in a public school. And on his first day of school, the teacher said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Charles Melvoin." And the teacher misheard and wrote down Charles Melvoin. And so he got home with that piece of paper, and his parents said, well, I guess Melvoin is our name now because that's what the teacher said. So I tell that story really because my family knew then what so many of us still know now, which is that the way to succeed in this country is through our public education system and public systems more broadly. And I think we can probably agree that most of those systems are broken. And so that was what catalyzed me into the world of education. Right after college, I graduated in 2008. I started teaching in LA Unified in Watts at the corner of 104th and Compton, in a school that was incredibly under-resourced. Only 4% of eighth graders could do algebra and were being failed on to ninth grade. The assistant principal the year before I got there was arrested for raping a student. And actually the year prior had brandished a gun on a parent and wasn't fired, was just moved from one school to another, and really catalyzed an interest in broader systems change. I ended up, long story short, suing the school district on behalf of my students, which then when I got elected to the school board years later, made a great first day of work when everyone was like, we remember you, you sued us. But it had catalyzed this interest in kind of advocacy more broadly. So I ended up going to law school based on that experience, working briefly in the Obama White House, and then came back to LA and got elected to the LA Unified School Board in 2017, and have been serving for the last 8 years, both trying to understand how to reshape education, and as some folks I'm sure in this audience can attest, in public education, also just trying to keep the lights on, and finding that pressure, which is the great tension, I know as we'll discuss, between theory and practice. District of 85% of kids living in poverty, 90% kids of color, and where my days, at least like today, have been mostly dealing with ICE raids and not about thinking through AI and the future of education.
So this is a super fun conversation because both of you come from public education, but from very different backgrounds and very different parts of the country. Allentown, Pennsylvania, that area, working middle class families. You're an LA Unified School District, one of the biggest school districts in the country. So I want to start with the same question and ask you both, when was the moment or time that you started seeing what you thought education should be and where it is start to drift apart?
My passion, my interests, my gifts and assets were in the area of the arts and music. And so I felt like that, I didn't know it at the time, but I felt like that was a place where I had a lot of agency and I could be myself. My curiosity, my creativity was recognized. And so I was good at that, and I was going to be a music teacher. And so I went to college, became a music teacher, did music for 12 years. My classroom, I felt like, was a respite for many students. It was a place where their curiosity, their creativity, their agency was allowed to be released before they went back into the assembly line of school. As you can tell, agency is at my core. And so when I became a superintendent, I felt like, and this is not something I'm terribly proud of, but that I had the authority to be able to organize and to say what the conversation was going to be. And so agency was a core piece, and walking around schools and seeing like, we're robbing kids of agency. This is a thing that's missing here. And so,
how would you define agency, just so we can have a working definition?
Yeah, I think that agency is a self-awareness of what your gifts and assets are that you bring to the world. And I think that's really one of the purposes of school, that we should create spaces where people can understand what are their gifts and assets. And then you are given the space to be able to release those things, share them, contribute. Okay. And so as a superintendent, I felt this dissonance between I'm leading the system. It's not what it could be. And I have these values inside of me. What do I do? So sort of looked out, started to learn how people lead these systems, and then was able to do various small things and change and start to think about how do we reorganize schools. So that was sort of the journey, not really a moment, but just a journey.
Thank you, Nick. How about you?
I think for me, it was more of a moment. Those first few days teaching, I just graduated from Harvard. I was coming to South LA to be like, oh, I'm gonna fix this. And I had these notions, right, of like, oh, this is great, like I can do this. So, and I was expecting, kids who weren't motivated, but I was going to motivate them, and parents who were disengaged, and teachers who were bad. And I was so quickly disabused of all that notion. And I met unbelievable kids with so much raw material. I met parents who were, working 3 or 4 jobs to support their kids, and were so motivated and weren't coming to back to school night because it was at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday and they worked. I met teachers, some of whom who had gone to that school themselves, who were working incredibly hard and were brilliant in an under-resourced school. And so it hit me over the course of those first few days that, one, I was naive and wrong, and 2, that the system is not set up for these schools and these students and these teachers to succeed. And that was also 2008, 2009. And so in February, right? The economy had fallen out. The district had to kind of cut half of its budget and laid off thousands of teachers. But because of the way the system is structured, 67% of the faculty in my school was laid off. Whereas on the west side of Los Angeles, where I had grown up, you maybe had one teacher, maybe. And so to me, it just was that kind of click of, well, this is about the system. This isn't about individual agents or actors. This is about a system that's is not set up for success for kids or the adults who work on behalf of those kids.
That's good. So for the past at least 10 years, it seems like when we talk about education, at least nationally, everything seems to really focus on like culture war stuff. And at the same time, it's like, okay, how do we prepare kids in the age of AI? Let's talk about staying competitive with China, all of these other things. What does teaching look like, and sort of it. And I'm surprised that it feels, at least from my own perspective, that that's really absent. And so, what conversation do you think we're missing when it comes to education, and why does it seem so? At least for the past 10 years, why does it seem so hard to have that conversation?
So I think, this is like teeing up to give you this answer, but I think in some ways we're missing this conversation. But what I will say is the reason I think is because there's not, to be candid, like a special interest group that is vested in this conversation. So when you think about, I would say it a little different than you. I would say 10 years ago, the conversation in this country around education was mostly around charter schools and education reform and unions. And because there were vested interests in those, you had folks, California doesn't have for-profit charter schools, but other states did. But even like you just had folks who had something to lose or had an angle. Then the culture wars, it wasn't too surprising to me, because if you go back 100 years to the Scopes trial, like where we're like talking about whether you can teach evolution, schools are where you are inculcating the future. And so the idea that folks on both sides would want schools to be able, to, yes, pro-LGBTQ or anti-LGBT, because they know that schools are, so that's less surprising. I think that the challenge is that there's no, besides rooms like this one, and I think most kids who are sitting bored staring at the ceiling, there's no one who is benefiting from us having this conversation. There's nobody there's a lot of special interests who lose out. When you think about the school district, as Randy knows too, there's like the different lobbies and the different interests we have to, from the dairy lobby, who requires that we serve milk in schools or we don't get federal funding for any school food.
And we throw it away.
But that chocolate milk was really good growing up.
You joke, TJ, but the number of debates that the school district in LA has had about chocolate milk and not chocolate milk, because yes, they drink it if you have it, but then they throw it away. And we have to have milk.
Got the same thing in Allentown, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, it is illegal. It is against federal law for a school district to disparage dairy. I swear to you, a student of ours, and then I'll turn to Ray, a high school senior was advocating at her high school, this was a few years ago, in LA Unified, about the benefits of water, and her administrator had to follow federal law by saying, you can't do that. We got sued, as we should have, and we were able to settle it. But the reason that we settled as opposed to the student winning is because it's actually a federal statute under the USDA that we cannot disparage milk. So I say that as one example of many of why we're not having these conversations.
What about you? What are we missing?
That's one of those weird parts of the system too, that just like it sends these signals that compel us to behave in ways that are totally weird. I think the culture war conversation is a distraction from a messier conversation that we need to be having. And I think that's around the purpose of education. One of the things that I always struggled with when I was in the system was the constant signals about college and career and how we are basically a machine producing workers for this capitalistic system that we work in. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I think that we shouldn't allow students to find careers and things like that, but it becomes the sole reason of why we have schools. And that's the message I think that the system has been sending us. And I think the messier conversation is, yes, having a job is a sliver of being a thriving human being. And that's the conversation that we need to have. What does it mean to be a thriving human being? And that is a conversation that is more important now than ever in the age of AI, where we're all worried about it taking away our humanity. So let's have that conversation about what does it mean to be a human being? And how do we help students find what are those gifts and assets? What are those uniquely human things that you are good at that you could contribute? That's a whole redesign of the system. That's a messy conversation because you've got all these factions. So I think the culture war thing is really just a distraction because we don't want to have that conversation right now.
I just add to what Randy was saying. I completely agree. And I also think it's not only that it's a messier conversation, it's that schools are so focused now in districts on metrics and outcomes. And there's no way to measure thriving human beings. You can measure college going rate. Here we have A through G readiness. You can measure math scores, test scores, attendance. You can even measure social emotional scores. There's CASEL and other frameworks to look at portfolio. You can't measure like thriving human. And so districts just say, well, if you don't measure it, like if we're not getting tested on it, we're not going to focus on it.
And that's a signal that the system tells us that as a school and a school district, you need to be focused on the quantitative and those kinds of measures. And how do we change that? That's part of the redesign.
How do we change it? And how do you break apart a centuries-old system now and redesign it slowly? I don't even know. You know what's crazy about this is and this is not a good look for an interviewer, I don't even know the first question to ask. And I think that's kind of where we collectively are as at least a nation to go, what comes first? And I mean, we understand that milk is the culprit here, okay? So
Big dairy. Well, I'll tell you, CJ, I'll say one thing, because there's an interesting model, and I know everyone's looking at AI, and there's Alpha School, which is in Texas, and it's a tech and a kind of a quiet tech billionaire who's been doing this. And the idea is you have an AI tutor for 2 hours a day, and then you're self-directed and it's project-based and all that. And without getting the merits of that, what I really like is that their one objective, their outcome, is they ask students, would you rather be on vacation or at school? And until 100% of the students say at school, like here, they don't consider themselves successful. So it's an interesting, it's a little elusive in the sense that like even I was, I think, a nerd in school and loved it, still think I would, want to go on vacation every once in a while. But it's a mindset shift where like if students are not saying, I want to be here because I'm enjoying it and this is what I want to spend my time doing, they don't think they're successful. And it's just a really interesting paradigm to think through.
Well, I'll try to frame it this way. Like is there one thing that we could start to give up? Like what would we have to give up in the public education system to see this come to life, or at least the building blocks?
Yeah. We're in a system where all the signals are about control. And if you look at the hierarchy, it's all about control. Federal government, state governments, school boards, teachers, and who's at the bottom of the chain? The students. And they're the ones that are expected to adapt, okay, to whatever else we as the adults want. So I think one of the big mindset shifts, as Nick mentioned, was we need to give up this idea that we need to control everything. And if we go back to the core of agency is not about control. It's about allowing other people to have control over their own curiosities. Now, is it chaos? No, it's not going to be chaos. There are definitely guardrails and parameters around which we work, but you're honoring somebody's agency and giving them the space to figure out what are they good at, what is their contribution, and I'm not going to control that.
When I think too, I don't think this conversation is just theoretical, because when we think about in something, let's throw out the book. There's literally, sometimes I bring as a prop to these talks, the California Education Code, which is like this thick. And you say, there's a whole, without getting into the merits of charter schools, which are relevant here because LA has more than anywhere in the country, but charter schools are exempt from like 95% of this book. And so one of the things I've been saying now, I've been on the board 8 years, and I've been saying it to the state legislature and the governor, is just like, give us the same freedom. Like, get rid of, if only 5% of that book, like the core safety and structure, is working for a lot of these schools, why are you requiring the rest of us to, like, not only the milk thing, but everything else? And so I think it's a lot of finger pointing, because we have a system of government where you have the governor who controls the educational budget, and the legislature who controls the education code, and then a state appointed board of education, and then an elected state superintendent of education, and then 1,000 school districts. You know that in LA alone, there are 81 school districts. Okay, LA Unified is the biggest by far. We're the second district and the largest in the country. But like, we're in Santa Monica, its own school district. Beverly Hills, its own. And so you just have so much. And so I really do think you throw out the book, but and get back to that relinquishing of control and seeing what might work.
I also think an important thing to understand about control is the people in the system who have the power went through the system, they were successful in the system, and they are all about preserving that power. They're all about preserving the system, and they've got the control. They're not going to give it up. They don't want to give it up, but they're going to have to if we want to redesign school. So the big question is, how do we help them? I don't want to say, I don't want to change their mindset, but how do we create the space for those people who are empowered to see the benefits of them giving up control, or at least some control? But I think control is one of the leverage.
Well, I guess that's my question is like, for people listening who are parents, who are citizens, not necessarily educators, like, is there a concrete way? I mean, we've seen, especially when it comes to cultural issues, we've seen people show up to school board meetings and get stuff changed for better or for worse, depending on what, it's like, what can we do on and maybe just give us like one or two things on a concrete level to start seeing that design, shift a bit?
So for me, language is really important. And if I'm a parent and I have a student, the language and the conversations that I have with that student are really important. And think about, if you are parents out there, what are the questions and the conversations that you have with your student? Are you saying things like, did you get an A today? Did you do all your work? Questions like that. Instead, those kinds of questions are reinforcing the system through what we currently have. If you want to change it, ask things like, we're focusing on curiosity here. What were you curious about today? Okay. Who did you work with today? What kinds of conversations did you have today? Those kinds of questions release agency and curiosity and start to reshape what students and children are hearing and how they act and behave in the system. And so every time we ask did you get an A, or what grade did you get, you're voting for the current system.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think too, that's such a great individual, coming at this for different vantage points, a great individual answer. And I think mine is more systemic, which is, and obviously I have a bias here, but I'm sure, without putting people on the spot, if I asked this group of folks, like, you could talk pretty fluently about federal politics and what's going on with the Trump administration and even this California gubernatorial race. But if I said, like, who's your school board member? Who's your city council member? Like, everyone kind of looks at each other. And yet that, when you're coming to these, or the legislature, where I'm talking about this education code, both state funding, the education code, all these controls, state accountability system, it's all the state legislature, your state assembly member and your state senator. And like, I won't do a show of hands, but most people probably aren't aware who that person is. And so I encourage, my answer too is also, I do encourage folks to show up into their local school board meetings and to their, get to know their local legislature and start to demand some of that. Because I do think that if we had more of a fever pitch around change of the education code or going after big milk, we could start to change things.
So Nick's cell phone number is...
Yeah. Too many people have it, but I appreciate that. And actually, speaking of cell phones, that's another thing that I did with parents. Last year, we banned cell phones in LAUSD, which also came from a lot of groundswell and parent support. And so there are opportunities to make these big changes.
Sure. We have time for one question. Yes, sir.
Regarding LAUSD, a few years ago, the superintendent did a radical thing by giving all the students their own personal laptop. That ran into some problems with theft. A lot of them got lost or was broken or stolen. But the concept itself, seems to me, it created agency with each student to be able to explore the world of their choosing through their computer. What did you think of that experiment? And is that something that it's maybe worth trying again?
Yeah, I'll say two things and then have Randy have the closing word here. One, that was a perfect example, I think, that happens a lot in public policy of like great idea, poor execution, which is like, let's close the digital divide and like just drop iPads that didn't have software on it. And there was an FBI investigation. And I had a different take when a lot of the kids were also breaking like into them or hacking them, instead of getting like disciplined, I would have been like, let's bring them to computer science and teach all these. But what So that had set the district back. COVID actually, for a lot of districts, accelerated it. And we actually are a district where now every student has a device. I'm actually now thinking about the deleterious effects of that. And the pendulum has swung. And so the cell phone ban was my first step. I'm thinking a lot about, especially in the grades before third, actually getting rid of devices and getting kids to play and be tactile and explore. But I do think at the middle and high school level that using those tools and not putting your head in the sand, and this is a conversation we're having a lot as a school district, which is, when someone, so like much of our day-to-day is now on the internet and now with AI, and even those who don't think they're using AI, like if you Google search, it's AI, and how to get students there and how to search, and also then how to supplement. That's one of the things I think school districts hadn't learned enough kind of lessons from COVID. Sometimes it's too black or white or the pendulum swings, but small schools, rural school districts where you can't take AP Japanese, like Zoom in and take it with us, or figuring out kind of the flipped classroom model, which is the kind of out of the Khan Academy and Khan, which is how to better utilize the teacher's time, which is not always just standing and lecturing. Because I tell you, I thought I was a really good teacher, but there are people out there who can teach To Kill a Mockingbird far better than I could lecture. But my skill set would be helping those students then with their writing and their comprehension. So that flipped classroom model, I think there's a lot of promise.
Randy, you live in this world. You think all the time about how do you take these big ideas and bridge the gap between idea and execution. And so I'd love for you to talk.
I sort of focusing on the issue of technology again, having been in that space at the time when one-to-one was coming into play, like in the 2010s or something like that. And we did a terrible job of it because we took this system and we thought it was a technical solution. We could just buy computers and put them over the same. We didn't change anything about the way that we taught. And it was kind of a disaster. It was just like it escalated productivity. It got us allowed to do things faster, but it didn't really change the way that teaching and learning happened. And I see that AI is the same way too, that we just want to tack it on. And what we're finding is that, oh my God, it changes agency and now kids are cheating. Okay. But it requires us to change what we believe about teaching and learning. And it really pushes us back to that idea of agency. This AI and technology really does amplify agency. And until we figure that out and do the really tough mind shift work, we're going to be banging our heads against those computers with all the AI and wondering why it just doesn't work.
Thanks so much for listening. If these conversations resonate with you, you can explore more episodes, writing, and ideas at notes.reculture.tv. And if you'd like to learn more about Reculture, our sense-making studio focused on brand, culture, and media advisory, our home is reculture.tv.